Okay, so thanks so much again for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it. First off, what is ACLU Washington? How did it get started?
Yes, well, the ACLU of Washington was founded over 100 years ago. We are a civil rights and civil liberties organization, and we base our work basically off the rights that are afforded to us by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so we leverage these documents to interpret what our rights are today. And we do that in a variety of different ways. I think people know us primarily as engaging in legal work. We are constantly in the courts litigating, doing amicus briefs, et cetera, arguing in front of the court. But we also do our work through policy and through legislative work. We engage with lawmakers, we lobby, and then we also do some community work. We're in coalition spaces, we're facilitating spaces to allow for conversation on some of these issues. And we're working on a variety of issues. So everything ranging from like healthcare to policing to tech and privacy. We do a lot of criminal legal reform work. My portfolio revolves around anything and everything regarding youth policy. So education equity, school to prison pipeline, juvenile justice. Been doing some censorship work as well, book bans. So that's a little bit about the ACLU. I think one of the most important things that I think about the ACLU is that we don't take any government money. So our organization is entirely funded by people. And because of the fact that we are funded by people, we feel that we are sometimes in a better position to push back on government because we're not dependent on the funds that they give us. And so, to I think that just awards us a extra opportunity to be a little bit more critical when we need to be critical about how things are moving through our state government and federal government, et cetera. So that's a little bit about the ACLU.
Mm-hmm. I was actually going to ask what kinds of services you provide. That was literally my next question.
Yeah, so I mean, we're not a direct service provider. As far as like services go, what we do is if a community reaches out to us and they need guidance, let's just say like on the school board level, they want to change some policy at the school board level, then we would work with them to figure out, what is the strategy, what does the policy look like? We might even help set up meetings with lawmakers or with school board members so that family members feel like they have someone in kind of their corner helping them. So we really do see ourselves as almost as like a support team for the groundwork that community is already doing. I think especially in the school setting, there are, foundational rights, and education is one of them. It's a constitutional right here in Washington State that students be provided a free and appropriate public education. And so, we work to ensure that. And also at the same time, every district does things a little bit differently because we're a very strong local control state. So we try our best not to butt ourselves into situations where no one's really asking us for help or support, and really lean into those spaces where people are coming to us and asking us explicitly, we need you guys to weigh in on this, or we would love your feedback, or we would love your help. Um, so that's kind of our methodology.
Mm-hmm. So I know that when Molly connected us, she said that you also work on isolation and restraint. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. And I noticed that you interviewed my colleague Andrea Cadlick, and Andrea and I are working very, very closely on this issue. And we were brought I think, into the world of isolation and restraint through Disability Rights Washington. But in the last several years, we've been working with them. We published a report back in February of 2023 that daylights how much more isolation and restraint is being used in Washington state compared to what it's actually supposed to be. And the numbers are, I would like to say that it's shocking, but maybe it's not as shocking the more that you do kind of this educational rights work. But the data across our state shows that students with disabilities, Black students, homeless students, students in foster care, biracial students are disproportionately being affected by the use of isolation and restraint across our schools. And I think the thing that is even more jarring on top of that is the fact that this is happening to some of our youngest kids. Students between kindergarten and fifth grade are by far the most affected by this practice. And so when we think about early intervention and how sometimes experiences early on in your life um, set the course or predetermine how you show up later on in life, like that is like the foundation of the isolation and restraint work. Because students that have been isolated, students that have been restrained, they're going to unfortunately carry that trauma response with them later on in life. And I mean, we have anecdotal knowledge of that. We also have just the fact that isolation and restraint is not too different than solitary confinement that is currently being used in our juvenile detention facilities and in our adult prisons. So we do see themes, and I've heard from a lot of people that isolation and restraint, being isolated and restrained as a child, essentially prepared them for prison later on in life. And so that's where the intersection of the school to prison pipeline really comes in to the isolation and restraint work. Hence why we are very pressed and interested in finding a way to change the law in Washington state.
Hmm. So what do you guys do to sort of mitigate, isolation and restraint and to create a more sort of safe environment for, like you said, people with disabilities, Black students and others?
Yeah, so one of the things that we are doing in the legislative route, I think, is trying to set up parameters in which restraint can be used. And with bec and I think there are things that restraint are and things that restraint aren't, and I will get to that. But I think first and foremost, what we want to stop immediately is we want to immediately stop the practice of isolation in our schools. Isolation is incredibly damaging to the psyche of students, and we're just not engineered to be isolated, especially at a young age. And I mentioned solitary confinement. It is very similar to solitary confinement. Some of the isolation cells that we've seen in schools across the state are like closet size. There's no windows, they're cold. Uh, so a young person who is perceivably in crisis is being separated when I think we know that there are better ways to resolve that crisis and address the harm in time. So that's the first and foremost what we want to do is to stop isolating young people. There are no circumstances in which a young person needs to be isolated. The issue of restraint is an area where I think we start to get into the definitions of what is permissible and what is not. And I think, for every isolation, there's kind of a restraint as well, because if a young person is resisting in isolation, the teacher or whoever inevitably has to put their hands on them to direct them into an isolation cell. And so that's a type of restraint that we are looking at. But ultimately, the restraints where they're preventing a young person from moving, or where they lose control of their body. I mean, we find that also damaging as well. And not even exclusive to this isolation and restraint space. I think what ends up happening is that students that have previous traumatic experiences in their life, maybe issues in the home, um, they carry that trauma response with them in the classroom. And so anytime they're being touched by anyone, it conveys a trauma response. And so inevitably, I think there are times where we think of um these scenarios that get thrown in there all the time of like, for example, and we hear this a lot actually, is what if a student is in the road and a bus is coming to them? Does that mean that a teacher can't pull the student out of the road to prevent them? Like, is that now considered a restraint? And I just want to be clear that that is not the type of restraint that we are talking about. um Obviously that at that point there is an imminent risk that that child is like probably going to get run over if they're not pulled aside. But um there are other types of restraint where two people are holding down a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old. And at that point, you have to realize, um, was there a need for that? Was the force appropriate at that moment? Or was it, comparable to the person that they were being restrained? And that's where we see a lot of discrepancies. And unfortunately, why we see a lot of bias as well is because some of the inherent racism and ableism that persists in our education system, where some student groups are perceived to be more violent than others and therefore more deserving of this sort of action, or less worthy of patience and grace. And so to get back to your question, I think what we're trying to do here is create parameters in the law, narrow down the law, and also create parameters so it's clear what is restraint and what is not. We don't want chemical restraint. We don't want mechanical restraint. And these currently are practices that are still allowed to be used in Washington state.
Mm-hmm. Lastly, what can people take away from this conversation? How can educators, teachers, and other professionals learn how to create, a safe space for their students? Because obviously, isolation and restraint, it can be a really sort of controversial
Mm.
strategy. But again, there may be times where it may be necessary. So what can they learn from this to sort of better handle those situations, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the things that we have been trying to put forth here is that um, the emphasis on investing in early interventions, and investing in um, just early connections. Like when I've spoken a lot about trauma and the trauma response. And the reality is, if a young person is exhibiting a certain type of behavior, they're not just trying to be like, you know, bratty or get their way. Like that is just how they are communicating, and they want to be heard. And so I think, and I sympathize with educators, and I continue to hear that um, it's really challenging to be in the classroom right now. And I don't think that we should let go of the reality that, I mean, this is a whole person with a whole like identity and experiences, lived experiences that they are bringing into the classroom with them. And so us um taking that and only seeing them when they're at their crisis point, um I think prevents us from looking more upstream to identify those triggers early on. One of the other things that we have been doing is trying to identify ways that we can increase capacity in the classroom. So last session, the last legislative session, we supported efforts to increase paratypical funding model, the prototypical funding model to allow for more para educators, to allow for more just like one-on-one staff to help in these situations. And so, but it has to be a both and approach. We can't just fund everything, or like, money itself is not going to solve the problem. There also needs to be a culture change. And so we are focusing on the both and of the situation here. We have to do both things at the same time. We can't wait to stop the harm until everything is funded, because that could be a very long time. And in the process, we have people that are suffering, both teachers and educators and students. We keep hearing that teachers are also getting hurt. And so we want to prevent harm as much as possible. And one way that we can do that is by eliminating isolation and reducing restraint in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right.